All right, looks like we are connected. Um, welcome everyone. Welcome to the last talk of the event. Hopefully you've all had a good conference so far. And I'm really excited to be here. My name's Rikin. I am an Android engineer at Pinterest. I've been there for about 2 years. Prior to that, or sorry, I've been there almost 3 years now. And prior to that, I was an Android engineer at Peloton. And so I've been doing Android for a little while. And I think like right now is the most excited I've been in terms of like where the Android development ecosystem is going, specifically with Jetpack Compose. The topic of my talk is going to be somewhat Compose related, but more specifically about previews and the reasons why I think previews are going to be really powerful as a development tool. And I guess the underlying theme here is in the tagline, which is avoid build times at all costs. So hopefully you'll have some takeaways on how to kind of reduce build times when utilizing previews. And if you ever have any questions or just like want to discuss like Android or Jetpack Compose, my Twitter handle is @HeyRakin, so feel free to DM me or reach out. I love talking about this stuff. So what are we going to talk about? We'll go over a little like basic intro into what Compose is and what previews are. Then we'll go into what my favorite part of previews are, which would be like setting up these isolated features and be able to use previews as a way to like deploy individual features. I'll go into a little bit about setting up dependency fakes, so faking out some of your dependencies to improve your build times. And then I'll go over a Grails strategy for previews that works well for me. And we'll ground that all with like a real world example of a little demo application that I built for this talk. All right, so I'm sure most of you by now have had a basic introduction to what Jetpack Compose is, but in case you haven't, it is the new declarative UI framework that's been released by the Android team. The main thing here is that there are these primitives called composable functions. So it's the annotated at composable. And what these functions are is they're typically used to represent some component that renders some UI, and they can be composed of other composables, like you kind of see in the right, as a sort of contrived example of what that might look like. I guess if you come from like the web world at all and you've worked with React, you can think of composable functions kind of like functional React components. They're essentially the same thing. You'll see a lot of parallels between React and Compose, actually. So it's interesting to see those. Previews are a way to just quickly visualize your composables, and I'll talk about that more in a second. And yeah, I think like Jetpack Compose has gotten me really excited about Android again. And to me, like it's made it fun again. So if you haven't tried out using Jetpack Compose for your project, I definitely recommend just like trying it out. It'll definitely change the way you think about Android. So like I mentioned, previews are a way to just like see your composables rendered in the IDE. And so if you look at the example on the left, we have 3 previews that are kind of rendering that greeting composable. And the cool part about previews is that you can actually change like the configuration that you're going to be rendering that composable in. And so like on the right, you'll see those are actually some of the built-in configuration options that you can set on previews. You can set like the width and height of the container. You can set the device frame that it'll be rendered in. So like you can actually like see it rendered in the tablet frame, but like in the IDE. It's pretty cool. But I think like the most compelling one is the locale configuration. And so I actually had some issues getting it to work, but assuming it does work, you can essentially tell your preview to render things in a different locale. And so if you're using any localized resources, it'll update your composable to use those localized resources. So you won't run into that issue where you have to change your device language to Japanese, and then you forget how to navigate back to the language settings because you don't actually know how to read Japanese. So yeah. Another really cool thing about previews, in my opinion, is being able to deploy them directly to your device. So, this is definitely a big win in my opinion. I don't know how many times I've just like created some custom view or some layout that I want to just like render on my device, and then maybe I had to do a bunch of like set up a container, set up an activity, set up a fragment or whatever. Or most of the time, I just kind of like hijack a screen in the app and just like inject that view component somewhere just so I can see it rendered. And so this is like a huge win. I can just deploy these previews and I can see my UI right away. And the last thing I want to talk about with specifically the previews is that they have very powerful in IDE support. And so like you don't like there might be a world where we don't actually need to even deploy these composables to your device or even run the application. You can actually see and interact with your previews in the IDE, and you can turn on this interactive mode, and you can actually see like the touch state change, and you can even see some state updates. So that's pretty cool. And it's not perfect yet, but the tooling's only improving. So the takeaway here is it's really going to improve the speed at which we can develop UIs. You can just quickly create these composables that represent your UI components, and then you can use previews to see them instantly in your IDE, and you can even deploy them to see what they look like on your device. And this will definitely save you a lot of time. So let's talk about isolated features. So what do I mean by isolated features? I mean features that can be built isolated from the rest of the application. And so essentially what that means is I can take my feature, kind of rip it out of my application and maybe like simulate the inputs and potentially like handle the outputs myself or stub out the outputs and side effects. And what that looks like in practice is kind of like a dependency injection model. And if you actually look at how Compose recommends you set up your composables, the example on the right is kind of like this stateless composable where you're passing in the state, which will contain all the information it needs for that composable to render. And then you're passing in some action handling lambda that passes the actions up. And so if you're running this in like a preview environment, you can easily just construct some dummy state to pass in and maybe just ignore the actions and let it no op. So yeah, so like building Compose in an idiomatic way already kind of sets you up for this. And then I think the most exciting thing to me is if you're utilizing previews in this way, you can essentially run these mini applications. And so what'll happen is your features will become these mini applications that you can run independently of each other. And then your app just becomes a composition of these mini applications that can all come together and form this awesome mega application. And if you've heard of people talk about like how they use sample apps, they're probably talking about similar thing. And lastly, like thinking about these features and like running these mini apps will really already set you up well for modularizing your app and being able to run set up separate feature modules, and it'll just set you up well for the future. Just some quickly want to go over some other benefits with this kind of way of thinking. If you work at a big company, you probably already work in feature teams where you have a bunch of teams working on the same application, but they're working on an individual like feature area or an individual slice of the application. So it'd be really nice if they could just deploy only that feature or that particular portion of the application and work on it, develop and update the feature, and then only worry about building the entire application when they are integrating that feature back in. And another benefit is that if you're writing code in this way and setting it up to be isolated and allow you to pass in these stub out the inputs and handle the outputs, you're setting yourself up for testing as well. This is exactly kind of what you want for a test environment to be able to test your composables. And as a corollary to that, if you're setting yourself up well for testing, you're going to set yourself up well to be able to refactor these features really easy. You can kind of think of these features as like mini plugins into your application, and really all you care about is like the inputs and the outputs of your feature. And so you can easily kind of test and change those and verify that the behavior kind of remains the same. And one subtle benefit that I think, I'm not too sure that this will occur, but I think that previews will enable non-engineers to kind of play with these features a little bit more. And so I can kind of imagine a world where designers can kind of jump into like an actual preview of a feature and maybe tweak the inputs here just to see how the UI reacts. And I think this will kind of unlock a whole new level of collaboration between engineers and product and design. But we'll see if that actually pans out. And so I mentioned faking dependencies. So let's say you have your isolated feature, you can run it in its own preview. So like what's kind of like the next step? Well, I think for me, that would be making sure that you're kind of able to like control the environment that it's being run in. And so I'll give you an example. So let's say I'm developing this real application here on the left. It's hitting it has a view model that talks to some repository, that talks to an API, and pulls some data and renders it in a list of rows. And this will look familiar because it's like 90% of the apps in the Play Store. But then Comcast does what it does best and has an outage in my area. And now all of a sudden, I'm developing the feature, I'm working on this feature, and I no longer have internet access, so I can't pull that real data. And so what I can do is, if I have a fake version of this API or this repository in place, I can use that fake repository with my preview, with that view model, and then I can just run that preview, and all of a sudden I have working application again, and I no longer am dependent on the internet changing. I'm in like a kind of controlled hermetic environment. And if I do want to test these edge case states, like what happens if I don't have internet, you still want to test these, and you can set up fake repositories or fake dependencies to kind of mimic these scenarios. And so I think it's a really powerful way to do that. The other thing is that real dependencies are expensive. And so like this is especially true when you're kind of like using a lot of third-party libraries. Like you can just be like adding a bunch of dependencies to your application. And at first glance, it might seem innocent, but there could be a lot of things being brought in with that dependency under the hood. And the thing that's going to suffer is your build time. And so you just have to be really careful. And the way that you can avoid this is just you're setting yourself up so that like you can kind of only incur that real dependency when you're building the application. And what does this look like in practice? You've probably seen this before. We use an interface and we interact with that interface, and then that interface has multiple implementations. One, for this example, there's a weather repository, and then I have a real weather repository that actually builds some retrofit service and hits the real API. But then I also can have like a fake weather repository where I can just quickly construct that data and use that for when I am developing with a preview. So let's talk a little bit about like the Grail strategy, because I think that this is important as well. So let's say that this is the current like Gradle module setup that you have in your application. And by the way, this is probably like better than most applications out there. I know that Pinterest is still even trying to get to this point where we are pulling out a bunch of these features into their own modules. But essentially, this looks like you have a core app module. You have a bunch of feature modules that hold like the domain of each individual feature. And then you might have some shared modules like a network module or some common code module. And so this would be my suggestion to kind of like update this strategy a little bit to work well with previews and work well with being able to deploy these previews and keep their size small and the build time fast. And so I'll go into each of these momentarily. So the first thing you might notice, and this is probably the most important thing, is I now have these two two modules for the network-related dependencies. I have that network, and then I have that network live. And so the network module, that only holds the interface and potentially the fake implementations. And then network live holds only the real implementation and whatever dependencies that real dependency needs. And so what this enables is that like anything that doesn't need the real implementation can only pull in that network module, and that way potentially you don't have to incur the cost of using the real dependency. And so if we look at what the dependency graph looks like for the core app still targets these feature library modules, and it pulls in that network live module, which depends on the network module, because the application needs it, right? When you're running the application, you want it to work and have access to that real implementation. However, if you look at a particular slice of like what a feature preview pulls in, one of the feature previews just depends on the feature library module, and then it only pulls in that network module, which contains the fake implementation. And so our feature preview will only have access to those fake implementations as well as the interface, and it won't have to incur the cost of bringing in that real, potentially expensive dependency. So let's try and go into an actual demo. So I'll show the code here. I'll bring up Visor. So this is the application that I built. It's, you know, the creative person that I am, I built a weather application. So you look at it, there's two core features here. You'll see a feed of weather. This is like a 6-day forecast of the weather in San Francisco. And then if I click on any item, it kind of drills into that particular day of weather and has some extra information like wind speed, humidity, and the confidence for that. So pretty simple application. And let's kind of look at the code a little bit. So if you look at it, the main activity is kind of setting up all of this. It has one view model that both of these composables will depend on. And then the main composables here are the weather feed, which represents that feed feature, and the weather metadata. And so if I drill into like weather feed, you can see how this composable is set up. And if I scroll all the way down, you'll see that I have that preview there as well. And so if I look at it, it probably won't actually render because I think this is a bug with previews and using coroutines in previews. But if I deploy this preview to my actual device, and let that run, you can see now I have this feature deployed on my device, and clicking these actions basically do nothing. They're stubbed out. And so that's pretty cool. And similarly, I can look at the weather metadata composable. And in this case, actually, it pulls state in a slightly different manner. So the preview actually works. And again, I can deploy this to my device. And I will basically just instantly deploy that feature, and I can test it out. So that's pretty cool. And if you look at how some of these previews are set up, you can see that it's pretty simple. It just sets up like a harness with the theme, and then it actually creates a real view model. But then that view model gets set up with a fake repository. And so if we dive into that a little bit, you can look at how this is currently structured, and you probably saw this on my slide, but we have that interface for the weather repository, and then we have the real implementation and the fake implementation. And so as it is now, like if your app was never to get any bigger and the build time was already really quick, then this is probably fine. But if you look at it right now, there's the current state of this application is there's only one module. Everything kind of lives in this one module. And if for some reason, some of these dependencies become really expensive. So for example, if like this real weather repository was like this giant dependency, this giant binary that took a very long time to compile, then this would be problematic because not only would the application take a long time to compile, but also your previews, even that are only using the fake implementation, will also kind of like incur that cost. It's like if you're running like a clean build, your previews will still potentially take a long time. And I actually had an idea of like how to simulate long build time. So like if you look down here, I kind of commented it out, but it's this giant array, this unsigned byte array, and it's really, really long. And it worked. It really like inflated the build time. But the problem was it also kind of froze Android Studio a lot. So it was kind of hard to demonstrate. It was kind of hard to like continue with the demo with that. But just to like show you really quickly, I took a screenshot of how long the build took, and took about 8 minutes and 45 seconds, slightly longer. And at that point, it was also kind of frozen. So yeah, it did work, and I was going to use that part of the demonstration, but I won't let you have sit through that. So just trust me that let's assume that this real weather repository is actually really expensive and it'll take a long time to build. And so let's kind of get it to that state where we've separated out some of these modules so that our previews can live in their own modules, and they can depend only on that fake repository so that they don't ever have to incur that cost of this real weather repository. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to quickly check out another branch, stash these changes, and then another branch. And then I'm just going to close this and reopen this, just because when changing branches that have varying modules, the IDE kind of freaks out. So it just helps to restart it. Okay. So it's syncing. Hopefully everything works. But quickly, you can kind of already see this module setup. Oh, I'm on the wrong branch. Let's restart it again. Okay. So again, let's look at the modules, and I basically set it up in the way I described in my slides, where I set up a weather feed feature module and a weather feed preview module. And then the other thing that is notable is I separated these two modules, weather repo and weather repo live. And so if I look at weather repository, if I find where weather repository lives now, weather repo, you'll notice that it lives in this weather repo repository, and it contains only the interface and the fake implementation. And then if I look at where real weather repo lives, this one lives in the weather repo live module, and it contains that real weather repository and the actual retrofit service. And so this is important because now if I look at the weather feed feature and I look at its build.gradle, it can only now depend on this weather repo module and not the weather repo live. And so if we look at weather feed, it now lives in the weather feed feature module. And again, if we look at the preview, it only needs a fake weather repository. And so now it'll work. But if you notice here, I'm in this weather feed feature module, and I don't see that play icon. And so like I actually can't run this preview from this module. And this is just because weather feed feature is a library module, and library modules can't have like runnable targets, unfortunately, or at least that's my understanding. And so the workaround here is I created that weather feed preview module. And so if you look at weather feed preview, this is literally just an application module that all it does is it has this weather feed preview class that holds this preview. And now if I were to run this, try, and hopefully the build succeeds. But I should be able to run this preview on my device. Taking a little while. There it goes. Oof. Okay, well, it's taking, oh, there it goes. took a lot longer than I actually expected, but ideally it shouldn't take that long. And you now have a preview that is in its own separate module, and I now can run it as its own separate application, and I don't ever have to pull in that real weather repository, which is really important because as the application gets larger and larger, you can do as much as you can to optimize your build time and optimize incremental builds and things like that. But I think like the benefits of having preview set up in this way is that like they're almost always guaranteed to be like relatively fast, and they'll usually have like by design you should keep the dependencies that they pull in as minimal as possible, and so this should be a good way to kind of like avoid that build time, right? So let me just, I actually want to show one more thing. Step 2, I'm going to close this, reopen it. Okay, so you have your application in a state where you have your preview modules, you have your feature modules, and all of them are set up so that they can run in their own container. They're pulling in fake dependencies. Everything is great. But let's say you kind of want to take it one step further, and you have this thought of like, what if yeah, it's cool I can run each feature in isolation, but what if I want to like test how all these features interact with each other, but I still want to like leverage that demo environment so that like I can have a faster build time. Well, you can actually do that using some of these principles. So if I go into this file right here, I created another small app module called Playground. And essentially all it has is this one file that I'm calling Playground. And it's basically setting up everything that main activity was setting up. The only difference here is it's actually faking out like the real dependencies, right? So Playground will only actually depend on the weather repo module and not pull in the real one. So if I run this, play the build runs, let it run. If I run this, I should be able to deploy this preview to my device, and hopefully we'll see a working application. That run for a moment. All right, it's installing. All right. So now I have a working application, and if I click on it, I'll actually be able to see the metadata as well. And so now I'm basically running my application in the dummy environment. And I know this is a pretty simple application, so it's actually pretty straightforward to set this up. For more complex applications, it'll probably take a little bit more finagling, but I think that with some effort, you could definitely do this, and you can get to a world where you're able to run your apps in like a kind of staging environment with fake data, and it doesn't actually hit the network, and it runs a lot faster. So let me go back to my presentation. So what are the takeaways here? So personally, I think one takeaway is that previews are extremely powerful, and if you are building a project using Jetpack Compose, I would recommend taking the time to use them and learn about them, because I think the tooling's only going to get better, and they're going to definitely be a useful tool in your arsenal. But if there's one important thing to take away, I think that like that separation of the interface module with the real implementation module, I think that's actually a really good strategy, and allowing your previews to only depend on that fake version or the interface and the fake versions of that of your dependencies will definitely help keep the build time for those really quick. And just to tack onto that, having fast deployable features is awesome. So like I don't like, I can count how many times that I was working on a feature and, I I deploy the application, and then I have to like navigate to my feature and maybe be in the right state. It's really annoying, and it's really cool and freeing to be able to just dive right into the feature that I care about and not have to worry about like setting up that state or logging in with the right account that has the right state for me to see the right screens. I can just set that all up front and deploy it and just go right into that feature. And yeah, it's amazing. And then the other thing that I probably don't have to explain to you is that long build times are awful, and they are very demoralizing. They are productivity killers, and uh, the takeaway here is that like we want to try and not have to suffer those long build times. And when you have a large application and you're working on like ginormous application with multiple developers pushing code, it becomes inevitable that the build time will suffer. And so we are applying strategies to kind of avoid that cost. So how can we apply this today? Well, that Gradle structure that I was talking about is actually kind of inspired. So it isn't something that I came up with myself. I kind of like iterated on some previous ideas that I got from Ralph Wondershek at Square. He actually has a really good talk on how Square sets up their Gradle modules for features, and it's a much more sophisticated system than kind of what I showed here. So I definitely recommend watching that if you are curious. And that has nothing to do with like Composer previews. That works with normal views, and you can set up these sample apps. It works pretty well. The other thing is like start creating fakes. So if you're writing unit tests and integration tests, you probably already are creating like fake versions of dependencies. But so they work well for your tests, but they also will work well for your previews and these like demo versions of your application. So definitely, like if you're not employing that technique, I definitely think you should. And lastly, like if you're just thinking about like, yeah, this all sounds good, but like I don't know how we're even going to use Compose in our application, and you're curious on like what like interop with Compose looks like, I highly recommend you look at Adam Bennett's series on how Kuva migrated their design system to Jetpack Compose. And so they interop with their main application, and they're actually using it in production. So definitely check that out. This talk was definitely inspired, but I think like the two main resources that kind of inspired me to even do this talk and try and write it out was Point Free, which is a kind of educational series run specifically for like functional programming in the lens of Swift and iOS development, actually. But they do a really good job at talking about concepts in a very generalized form that kind of applies outside of just that particular domain. And I actually used their Designing Dependencies series to and essentially model my talk after that. So it has been probably the most like valuable educational resource I've invested in a while. So I highly recommend you check it out. And then another resource that I used in preparation for this talk was a little article that Bill Phillips at Cash App wrote on attacking build times with sample apps, where he kind of goes over that strategy of using sample apps and keeping them really, really lean so that like you can just quickly iterate on UI and screens using sample apps and not incur the full cost of building your entire application. And then I'll post these slides, but I have a link to the demo application that I built. So you can check that out at GitHub, and you can check out like how those Gradle modules are set up and play around with the code. So yeah, that's it for me. Thanks so much for sitting through this, and hopefully you learned about Compose a little bit and about previews, and maybe a little bit about like Gradle modules. And if you ever have any questions, again, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I'm at Rikin. So thanks.
All right, the finale is finished with a great closeout. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries.
That's a very clean for a first time presenter. My God, that was clean. Well done. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I appreciate that. I appreciate it.
Seems Matthew Ramsden landed four questions in the Q&A. One of them it doesn't seem to be a question, but probably at least a compliment to you. So fun to read. If you want to go through those while Rikin's going through those, anybody else who has questions, definitely please post them in the questions tab on the right.
Yeah, sure. So let's see. Matthew Ramsden asks, are you using previews at Pinterest? If so, how widespread is it among the team and how well has the uptake on it been? So we are not currently using previews at Pinterest. In fact, we're not really using Compose at Pinterest at all yet, but we are actually experimenting with Compose and how we can integrate it. And so we have actually set up our app to be sort of Compose ready, and we started to port over some of our UI components to Compose just to test it out. And so hopefully I'll be able to answer that question in the near future. I'm really excited about it. And I think that like we could definitely leverage previews if we are using Compose for our UI components. And then the next question, also by Matthew, is I'm obviously wanting to become an Android. I'm obviously wanting to become an Android dev now. You pushed me over the edge in a positive way. Okay, that's not a question, but I appreciate it, Matthew. Appreciate it. It's fun. It's fun. Definitely check out Jetpack Compose. Uh, if you use Swift UI, as it says you're an iOS developer, if you use Swift UI, it's very similar. So that's the other kind of fun benefit of learning these declarative UI frameworks is they're very similar to each other. So using one kind of helps you learn the others and kind of translates well. Matthew again, if someone was coming from Android to iOS, the first recommendation would be Point Free. If someone was going from iOS to Android, what would the best recommendation resource be? Um, that's a good question. Honestly, like if you the Android documentation, like the Jetpack documentation, has improved a lot, and the Compose team or the people working on Compose have done a really good job at improving that documentation, providing examples, providing samples. So I would recommend that. Previously, I probably wouldn't have recommended the developer docs, but it's actually come a long way. So that would probably be my first recommendation. And yeah, otherwise, yeah, I would say start with the docs. And then they also have pretty good code labs for Compose now. So definitely use the Google resources. Gaurav Mathur asks, this talk makes me miss my Android days. What else are you excited for in the Android world? Well, so I think that Jetpack Compose is probably the most exciting thing. And I think that the thing I'm most excited about is people have really been pushing the envelope with developing Android applications, and you're already seeing people use Jetpack Compose and learning how to like use animations and transitions and building these like really kind of beautiful experiences that I just haven't like seen in like the Android ecosystem in a while. And so I'm just excited to see the next generation of Android apps. And I kind of want to see more like indie Android developers kind of pop up. I feel like the iOS ecosystem has a lot of like solo or small developers that are able to build like successful businesses and applications. And I haven't seen as much of that in the Android space. So hopefully like these tools help make it easier to build these UIs, build these applications, and build beautiful experiences and improves that. Let's see. Nathan Retta asks, do you run a shared consistent architecture between iOS and Android with Compose / Swift UI? So currently, no, but that has actually been on my mind a lot. I think that having a shared architecture really allows like the mobile teams to collaborate a lot more, and you can talk about you don't really have to talk about like necessarily implementation details, but you can talk about how you set up features and talk about like how you set up those up at a high level. And I think it does pay dividends if we're able to kind of unify that across the entire mobile team. And so hopefully we get to that point soon. With regards to Compose and Swift UI, we actually don't use either of those technologies at Pinterest currently, like I said, but I think that it's only a matter of time before that becomes the standard. And so I'm excited to see the future. And then Matthew again, this was awesome. Wondering if you've seen any designers in real life start using previews in Jetpack Compose in the same way they started using Swift UI previews. So no, I haven't actually, but that's kind of why I think that Jetpack Compose previews will enable the same behavior that Swift UI previews have, where designers can potentially even build designs in Swift UI and Jetpack Compose, make it a little bit easier, and potentially design in code. I know that movement's been going stronger, where designers are actually writing code and testing some of their designs in code rather than just in design software. I think that's a great thing, and I think it'll be really powerful. And it'd be kind of cool if like engineers and designers can like collaborate on designs, but in code. Not to say that the engineers shouldn't also learn like design tooling. I think that collaboration is still really important. But yeah, I'm just excited to see any form of more collaboration between engineering, design, product, where we can kind of like cross paths. And I think that's all the questions. Let's see, check the chat, see if anyone asked anything. Been avoiding preview the past couple months, motivated to play around with my app now. Yeah, definitely do it. They're pretty good. There's some kinks here and there that need to be worked out, but Jetpack Compose is still in beta, so I guess that's forgivable.
All right, and I guess we're ready to close out. Thank you again so much. Like that was great. Very like super engaging talk. So well done, Rikin.
Yeah, appreciate it, Shalom. Thank you.